The elevator bell cut through the chatter like a small metallic gasp, and for a beat, the corridor seemed to hold its breath. Fluorescent light slid across polished shoes and glossy badges and found her in the corner, a streak of pen ink on her knuckle, a folder hugged to her chest. He stepped out as if the air itself parted for him, shoulders set, a coat that did not crease, and a silence that bent people around him. He moved with the kind of certainty that erased hesitation. She kept her hair tied back, never wore perfume that announced her, and made neat notes no one read. She had learned to inhabit the edges. He had learned to be the center. When someone in the hallway laughed at a joke that was not his, he glanced up, long enough for the sound of that laugh to lodge where it did not belong. Only then did he see her. That look was a fault line. She had been invisible for years, and in the time it took for him to notice, every routine she had built began to rearrange herself. She said, "Good morning, sir." He said, "Good morning, Sophia," and the syllables pulled a charge through the room. Something cracked in the building in that moment. It was small, it was huge, and nothing after it would be the same. Sofia Rivera had been the kind of assistant people mistook for background. She could read a contract for errors at a glance, could smooth an impossible calendar into coherence with a few keystrokes, and caught the unspoken threads of the office when clients left furrowed. She had grown up in a cramped apartment where time was measured by the hum of the laundromat downstairs, and where her mother, Rosa, taught her how to make tamales while counting bills. She kept those lessons in the way she folded envelopes and in the quiet steadiness with which she oriented herself when the building tilted. She had gone to night classes, studied shorthand into the small hours, learned to carry a cup of coffee steady so it did not announce her presence. Those private hours made her reliable and invisible in equal measure. She was not seeking notice. She had wanted only a steady paycheck and the ability to send occasional money home to Rosa and to Ethan, a cousin who had helped her move when the rent got tight. The job at the Rinaldi Group had been a career detour she had never imagined would matter beyond the tasks printed on her desk. Marco Rinaldi was a man whose arrival changed room temperature and conversation. He wore seriousness like an heirloom, and had eyes that catalogued people quietly, as if inventory were a moral act. He had succeeded in a world that respected strength and feared softness. He was generous with loyalty and merciless with betrayal. He carried a scar at his temple from an incident the press never printed, and told a story in the curve of his jaw that made interns straighten up. He had scholars and lawyers and men who called him boss, and men who called him something else. When he spoke, people parsed meaning as if it were currency. Children of the city learned to lower voices when his name passed like a rumor. He grew up in a neighborhood where silence was protection and power was measured in what you could keep. That upbringing taught him to move with caution and to expect allegiance before intimacy. His public posture was polished and forbidding. Privately, he kept a list of those who had hurt him and a precise method for repayment. He noticed people who glowed with usefulness and those who flinched from their own reflection. When he noticed Sophia, the ledger shifted, and for a man who counted everything, that was dangerous. The office moved in rhythms of coffee runs, contract signings, and the whisper of the legal team. Rosa Alvarez manned the reception with a gossip that was kind and sometimes sharp. Ethan Cole, who handled IT, knew how to make a printer work when it wanted to spite the company. Antonio Russo, Marco's right hand, wore suits that seemed sewn to decree and watched the floor like he watched his own pulse. Claire Bennett from legal carried folders that smelled faintly of lavender and held the language of permission. Damian Park ran security like his life depended on the right angles of cameras. Enzo Vitale managed investor relations and smiled like a man who sold confidence for a living. Maya Lin wrote for a city blog and always had a camera ready. Luca drove the black car that came to the back alley and took people where they needed to disappear. They occupied the office as instruments and as witnesses to the same small rituals, and none of them had been trained to imagine an assistant could be more than an efficiency. Sophia's days were a litany of small obligations. She checked Marco's schedule at 7 and made sure his morning briefing was printed and folded the way he preferred. She would adjust the blinds in his office to prevent glare on the file he wanted to read twice. She knew his lunch orders and how he liked his coffee strong and black. Most days, he did not look at her. He asked things through a curt manager or through Antonio, and his absence of gaze became part of the wall that kept ordinary people out of his world. She learned to read the spaces between his orders the way others read a map. Once in a great while, he would incline his head at something she had done, and the gesture felt like a secret payment. She kept her station because it was honest work, and because honesty kept her safe. For years, he never slipped further into her orbit. One morning, the elevator opened on a rain that pressed like a hand against the windows. He stepped out in a coat salted with mist and moved through the foyer as if through his own temperature. She was organizing a stack of folders when Enzo walked past, laughing with an investor, that laugh spilling like a dropped coin. He turned toward it, and Marco's look landed on her in the slice of a second it takes to steal a breath. It was the look that would recalibrate everything. She felt it first as a plunge beneath the ribs, an ache that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with exposure. The hallway had the smell of ozone and cheap cologne and the rustle of paper. For the first time, Marco held his gaze longer than necessary. He stepped forward and said, "Sofia, handle the Alvarez file." She said, "Of course." Her hands shook inside the calm of her desk. The laugh had been a spark. The spark found tinder. Work is a geography of habits, and the Rinaldi Group had been mapped around Marco for years. On the second day after that look, small changes began to ripple outward. She found a new calendar entry in Marco's handwriting and a note that read, "Check this with me at 3." It was an appointment she had not requested. She adjusted the paper with fingers that suddenly felt like an unlicensed nerve. Rosa noticed she was quieter and slid a carton of empanadas across the desk midday like a conspirator. Ethan sent a meme at 2:30 and wrote, "You good, Soph?" She typed back, "I am." She was not only Sofia anymore, she was a variable. The elevator that afternoon smelled of wet wool, and the corridor felt narrower. Marco arrived with Antonio and Damien and a file that bounded under his arm. He closed the office door with a finality that made the room sound smaller. The leather chair behind his desk cradled him, and he leaned back in a way that drew the light to his face. He watched Sofia stand by the desk as if watching someone inspect a painting too small to be noticed. He did not speak at first, which is a kind of pressure. She cleared her throat. He said, "You have done good work on the Cantrell pitch, and I want you here for the afternoon." She said, "I appreciate it, sir." He said, "Call me Marco." And she felt the word make the floor tremble. Antonio shifted in the corner and said, "With respect, boss, you should not complicate her position." Marco's voice tightened a fraction, and he said, "I am not asking for complications." He closed his eyes as if measuring something intangible. The air tasted metallic, and there was a low hum from the building's cooling system that sounded like a contained animal. She sat across from him, and they spoke of margins and presentation styles, and he corrected the phrasing of a slide as if he were placing his hands on the language. The conversation moved forward, and then stalled, and then became almost a conversation that was not about work at all. There were 8 exchanges in that hour that were not about bullet points, and 4 times when their hands reached for the same pen and withdrew. The friction was an electric language. Her backstory, when it found its way into the silence, came out in small anecdotes she did not mean to tell. She spoke of nights studying instead of going out, of a mother who worked double shifts, and of a cousin who had been arrested and taught her how fragile normalcy could be. Those paragraphs of memory were short and precise, like the notes she took at meetings. They outlined why she worked, why she did not call attention to herself, and why she kept the tiny rituals that made her feel anchored. Marco listened with a tilted attention that made the details dangerous. It was the kind of listening people reserve for things they think they can claim.
In 3 paragraphs that spread like a map across the desk, she gave him the coordinates of where she had come from and where she wanted to be. He received them like a man who cataloged assets and liabilities and decided, with a glance, that the sum was more interesting than the parts. Word moved like a current through the office. By the time the day folded into evening, gossip had formed, and names populated the murmur. Enzo teased about the new arrangement in investor relations, and Claire raised a brow in legal and said, "Keep your hands clean." Rosa smiled at her with a protective tilt of the chin, and Ethan texted a string of laughing emojis like an anxious friend. Damien reported changes to Antonio, and Antonio reported to Marco, and Marco reported only where it mattered. Within 48 hours, her desk had been moved nearer to the inner sanctum. People noticed. People made notes. The rumor mill added texture, and the building rehearsed 1,000 little glances. Those who had been used to ignoring her now found themselves adjusting posture when she walked past. Gossip was a slow, combustive thing, and it had found fuel. Now the comment to you, the viewer. How would you react if you were in Sofia's place, suddenly visible to the most dangerous man in the city and relocated under his watchful eye? Tell us what you would do. Start your comment with, "I would stay," and then complete the sentence. Were you the one promoted? Would you accept the new attention or resign quietly to the edges? Your answer tells us whether you see opportunity or danger. Share one sentence about what you think will happen next and begin it with, "I think." We read every comment, and many of our future episodes are guided by what you tell us. Your words matter because
This story is not only about them. It is about how we, the audience, decide to interpret desire, power, and protection. Now we return to the office. Promotion came folded within a wave of small public confirmations. Invitations to meetings she had not been allowed into before, a nod from Marco in a town hall that felt like an investiture, a business lunch that required a presence at the main table. The names that reacted were many. Enzo Vitale made a pointed joke that landed flat and later left a message on her phone that read, "Congratulations, Sofia." Claire Bennett adjusted her glasses and told her to document everything. Antonio gave a grunt that could have meant a lot of things, and Damien added a camera to the corridor outside her new station. Maya Lynn's blog picked up a whisper and posted a photograph of Marco exiting the building with someone in a coat. Luca drove her home the evening after the announcement and asked how she felt, like a man used to reading the road for signs. Those reactions were the punctuation of status change. At the water cooler, Ivan from procurement said, "Big move," and Lavinia from HR smiled like someone who had read the script twice. The promotion did not come without costs. An investor called to ask questions about the stability of the team. An old client withdrew in a cautious email, and someone leaked a rumor about her being more than an assistant. The office map redrew lines. Some people stepped forward under pretense and then retreated. Others used proximity like a test. She felt watched in new ways. Her emails began to be copied to people who previously never saw them. She received a small bouquet at her desk with no card and a plain envelope that contained a single photograph of herself taking the subway last winter. The bloom of attention felt like a crown and like a leash. In public spaces, whispers folded around her, and in private, she felt the weight of eyes that considered her a prize. Threats arrived like a slow drip, and then as discreet blows. A package came to the mailroom, a box wrapped without return address, containing a printed dossier of personal items and a single note that said, "Not everything that glitters is yours." Damien found the box on a Tuesday and called Antonio, who called Marco. The security protocol was enacted with an economy of motion that betrayed many rehearsals. Cameras were checked, access logs pulled, the package scanned, and then quarantined. A message in a cryptic encrypted thread landed in Marco's phone, indicating someone was watching movements into and out of the building. Maya asked her politely if she wanted to speak on camera, and then advised discretion. Antonio set 2 men to follow her home for a week without telling her their names. Luca changed routes.
Damien reconfigured the patrols in a way that added layers without fanfare. Here is how the security procedures worked in practice. First, Damien called a meeting of the security team and cross-referenced access logs for the past month. They extracted footage and used timestamp correlation to see who had approached her desk. They updated the building's visitor manifest and flagged 3 license plates that had shown repeated interest. Damien instituted a check-in procedure for all packages delivered to the mailroom and required sign-off from an on-duty supervisor before delivery. He prepared a dossier with names, faces, and times and fed it to Antonio and to Claire so law could be engaged if needed. They also encrypted sensitive communications about the matter and set up a digital perimeter around Marco's schedule to prevent leaks. The process made a cold map of risk that felt clinical and intimate at the same time. Marco decided that discretion would be poor protection and elected a more personal solution. He called Sofia to the penthouse, a place she had seen in passing but never in full. It was a movement across the line from public to private and from protocol to possession. The penthouse smelled of rain and lemon wax and leather. The city at night spread under the glass like a map he could control. He told her, "We will keep you here for a while," which was not a question. She felt relief, which surprised her, and panic, which surprised her more. The nights that followed were episodes of proximity. He assigned Damien to the building and Antonio to oversee who came through the front door. He asked about her life and listened in ways that rewired the meaning of boundaries. She ate meals at his table and learned that his hands were exacting when he buttered bread. They shared silence that was not empty and conversations that were too sharp to be only polite. The private safety had the texture of ownership. He bought extra locks and installed biometric sensors. He offered her work at new hours and a line item in the corporate expense account for travel and clothing. He told her to change her phone number and have Ethan set up a second email for public contacts. He introduced her to Claire Bennett as someone who would handle liaison with investors and clients and made sure there was a story for the press that made the change appear reasonable. The intimacy of protection was doubled by the outer reality of increased power. Their evenings included long talks and shorter silences, and the precarious learning of 2 people mapping their borders. There were 6 sensory details that stitched this domestic life: the scent of lemon wax on the table, the click of winter boots on the penthouse tile, the texture of his wool coat over her shoulder, the metallic tang of city air late at night, the muted thud of the security van at 3 in the morning, and the taste of oversteeped coffee shared at dawn. Tensions escalated when the threat became a physical reality. On a rain-blown night, a black SUV breached the perimeter of the penthouse compound and shots were fired at the gate. The security alarm trilled at 3 in the morning and the smell of smoke threaded the air. Sofia woke to a metallic alarm and heard Antonio call out names while checking windows. The compound had been tested, and they responded with trained movements. Marco moved without hesitation and took Sofia down a stair that smelled of oil and old concrete, while Damien broadcast instruction into an earpiece. There were 3 principal moments of fear that expanded time into fragments. In the first, she thought only of the sudden absence of normalcy. In the second, she remembered a childhood memory of shelters and the taste of dust, and wondered if survival always relied on running. In the third, she had to decide to trust a man whose hands had kept accounts and who now told her to move where his voice could reach. Those moments were a string of choices, memory and reflex rolled into decision. They found Maggie, a housekeeper, who had been awakened by sound, and sheltered Sofia with a blanket, while Antonio shoved a small bag with papers into Sofia's hands and said, "Leave copies of these with Rosa." The fight that followed was close and violent. Bullets made small constellations against glass, and a driver in a black car took a wound. Luca returned fire and took the wheel with the steadiness of someone used to roads that bled into danger. Marco took a shoulder wound, a wet bloom there that smelled like perfume turned metallic. He kept his face composed and his hands dexterous, while Damon applied pressure to slow the bleeding. She learned how it felt to balance fear with a new type of fierce attention. The aftermath of the assault rewrote the ledger. The city's rumor pages filled with blurred video and questions. Enzo called investors and spun narratives. Claire reviewed legal options and said, "We can press charges if we can identify them." Antonio convened men and names and put in a request to trace the plates. Maya sniffed out an anonymous tip about Enzo and published a piece that connected dots that did not belong together. Marco's wound seemed to sharpen him in the way pain sometimes clarifies. He said, "You will not go back to your old desk," and he meant it the way a seal means ownership. Sofia watched him in the hospital room later, the white sheets smelling like antiseptic and something older. She noticed the way he frowned at a TV that showed their faces in flashes, and how he answered questions with the compressive language of someone who refused to be vulnerable. He told her, "You are mine now," and the phrase landed like a verdict and like a promise. The public declaration came faster than anyone predicted. In a meeting that was
Parts, boardroom, and stage, Marco stood and said, "Sofia Rivera has been indispensable to our operations and will now be Senior Executive Assistant and Liaison to Investor Relations." The room clapped with different languages. Some clapped for loyalty, some for optics, others for the story. He did not elaborate on the reason beyond commitment and excellence. The statement read like a contract and had the finality of a decree. Claire signed off on a press release that framed the move as strategic and respectful. The city noticed, and some corners of the network understood what it meant to make a private claim public. Enzo's smile thinned in a photograph, and Ivan from procurement sent a private message reading, "Congrats, but watch yourself." The social map of the firm had redrawn itself, and with it, the vulnerabilities. The consequences for the criminal network were immediate. A rival cell that had been hovering at the edges pulled back and tested maneuvers. Marco consolidated trust with a set of moves that were surgical and public. He met with his inner circle in a room that smelled of old leather and tobacco. Antonio outlined a plan to unmask the group that had sent the package and arranged for certain assets to be frozen. He placed calls to Claire and a legal team that included an outside counsel who could navigate the gray areas of the city's system. They closed accounts, moved funds, and used surveillance to triangulate a lead. Marco gave orders that were precise and cold, and in the way they were given, suggested a man who would not be questioned. Outside the firm, rumors suggested retaliation. Inside, people rearranged themselves in anticipation. Sofia's transformation was not without internal cost. She slept badly, woke to the phantom of footsteps, and found herself reciting safety checklists in the dark like prayers. She learned to watch a room for exits and to carry a small, steady anger that had the taste of survival. She resented being protected sometimes, and resented herself more when the protection felt like a gilded cage. She also felt a strange comfort in the arms that had steered her through danger, and the way Marco watched her had moved from curiosity to something like devotion. There were moments when she caught him staring at her not as an employee, but as someone who had become vital to his internal order. She asked herself whether she had traded invisibility for safety, and whether safety was worth the price. The conflict nested in her like a pebble in a shoe. 3 moments of tension crystallized into decisions of their own. The first time she saw Marco in the back of his car after a night of meetings and found his shirt stained with blood from surgery, and the way he denied it. The second, when she received a message that her cousin Ethan had been stopped by police and charged with something that smelled of setup, and she had to decide whether to involve Marco's men. The third, when Enzo made a move to broker an offer with a rival and she overheard the call and had to choose between loyalty to her boss and the impulse to step away. Each moment stretched into memory and choice. In those 500-character spans, she remembered who she was and who she might become. The climax arrived like a storm that the city had been warned about and then refused to see. Enzo's collusion with outside elements culminated in a night where the investor dinner turned into an ambush. Guests had been guided into an annex and then out in white lights, and orders were shouted. Security responded. Marco stood between a bullet and a woman from investor relations and took a wound that folded him into silence. Sofia watched as people moved with terror and precision, and in the middle of it, she stepped forward without thinking and held a hand that had lost warmth. The shooting lasted minutes that felt like hours,
And when the dust settled, there were 2 dead and others wounded, and a city that would no longer pretend ignorance. Marco's bleeding was serious but not fatal, and Sofia found herself pressed against him in a way that conflated tenderness with necessity. She said, "Do not leave me," and he said, "I will not." She saw then how thoroughly the life they had made together was bound to blood. After the violence, public reaction was swift. The board solidified behind Marco, and the police took statements. Claire negotiated a press statement that framed the incident as an attack on the company and on corporate safety. The legal web tightened, and they pursued leads that implicated Enzo in treachery. Antonio moved through networks and called in favors. The city watched the Rinaldi Group with a mixture of fascination and fear. Sofia found herself at the center of a media storm and at the seat of a power that demanded loyalty and silence in equal measure. She had to decide what to say to the cameras and what to leave unsaid. The choice to make a public declaration with Marco was as much a tactical decision as an emotional one. In the weeks that followed, the healing was procedural and intimate. Marco's wound closed under careful hands, and the office returned to a new kind of order. They announced publicly that Sofia would represent the company in community outreach and in investor relations with Marco's backing. The press wrote pieces about loyalty and leadership, and the city argued over whether love had anything to do with strategy. She stood beside him at a community luncheon and felt people look at her in ways that mapped ownership and respect at once. She found herself repeating his phrase that he had spoken when he was injured, "You are mine," and she learned to say it as if ownership could be a shelter rather than a 1 month later, the paper mentioned them in the society column, and there was a photograph of Sofia at Marco's side at a charity dinner. She had new clothes that fit a narrative and a car that smelled of new leather. Her mother Rosa visited from out of town and watched her daughter with a pride that flinched at the visible danger. Sofia asked Antonio to keep a low profile for her mother, and he promised. She wrote a check in the company ledger to a scholarship fund and felt the strange satisfaction of using her visibility to buy a chance for someone else. There were gestures in public that bent toward normalcy. She kept a list of people she trusted and replenished it slowly. Private messages arrived from old colleagues and from distant friends with congratulations and warnings. She found herself sitting at the penthouse window often, tracing the city below, and feeling both the weight and the currency of the attention she carried. Her world now had a border that kept certain things out and let others in on the condition they knew their place. 3 months later, rumors calmed into reports and into an uneasy truce with the gossip mill. Enzo had been quietly removed from his post and signed a settlement that included a confidentiality clause. The board had strengthened security protocols, and the company had been audited for its response to the breach. Marco's presence in meetings now functioned as a kind of unspoken insurance, and investors reported quieter nerves. Sofia had been offered a seat at a small advisory meeting, and her voice had been heard on policy that affected employee safety. She invested in a small apartment across the river that served as a refuge and kept a set of documents at the ready in case old dangers resurfaced. Ethan, who had been cleared of the setup that had briefly threatened him, came to visit and laughed in a way that sounded like someone who had been allowed to start over. She learned to accept that her life had new layers and that acceptance was a practice rather than a conclusion. 6 months later, the city had mostly turned a page. The Rinaldi Group had solidified alliances, and some areas of the network had been cut away. Marco returned to the public eye with a measured cadence, and Sofia stood with him at the opening of a community center that bore the company's name. She had chairs in the boardroom and a voice in hiring policy. She had sent Rosa to visit the old neighborhood with her cousin Ethan and helped secure a grant for a youth program. The wound on Marco's temple had faded into a pale line, and he had started to leave notes on her desk that were not strictly work-related. She had learned to sleep without the list of safety checks in her head, and to let the city feel less like a map of threats and more like a backdrop to the life she had chosen. They had made a declaration of shared custody over a brand and over a life.
There were mornings where he would find her in the kitchen wearing his shirt and make a coffee like a man who had learned the language of domesticity through necessity. Yet there remained the inescapable promise that if anyone ever touched what belonged to him, there would be consequences without negotiation. The story closed in a way that echoed the opening. The elevator bell still sounded in the same metallic way, and sometimes Sofia would pause when it chimed, as if to measure how far she had come. She, who had once been a background presence, now had a name that carried weight and enemies who measured their moves in silence. She had gained protection and power and had learned to trace their contours. She had imprinted on her life a strange combination of tenderness and iron. If someone dared to claim what was his, there would be no discussion, only response. The city had new rules, and she had learned to write some of them. If you would see what happens next, tell us in the comments, starting with "I would." If you want more episodes like this, subscribe and join our community where we talk about choices and consequences and where your voice shapes the next story. Stay with us because this is not the end, only the beginning of a very dangerous love.